No one understood the Japanese millionaire until a waitress did something no one expected. She spoke Japanese. What happened next changed everything. The chandeliers sparkled like frozen stars above the velvet-draped tables of La Rue, one of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurants. Everything in the room whispered wealth: white linen, gold-trimmed plates, hushed jazz from a live trio tucked into the corner. Waiters glided silently between tables like tuxedoed ghosts. This was a place where secrets were kept and status was measured in glances, not noise. At precisely 8:07 p.m., the double glass doors parted and silence rippled subtly through the room. She stepped inside alone. Elizabeth Morey didn't need an entourage. She didn't need to speak. Her presence filled the space with the quiet gravity of someone who knew exactly who she was and how much power she held. A sleek black dress hugged her frame, and a delicate emerald pin shimmered on her silk shawl. Her posture was perfect, movements deliberate, eyes calm. The hostess straightened instantly, murmured her name like a sacred phrase, and led her to a private corner table already prepared. As Elizabeth moved through the room, heads turned, first discreetly, then boldly. A hedge fund manager in the far booth nudged his colleague. A woman in designer heels lowered her champagne flute mid-sip. Even the waitstaff seemed to handle her tableware with more care. There was something almost cinematic about her, an elegance sharpened by solitude. She took her seat gracefully, opened the menu, and waited. Minutes passed. A young waiter finally approached, not with the ease of practiced service, but with the rigid energy of someone trying too hard. He looked barely 23 and already sweaty under the collar. "Good evening, ma'am. Would you like still or sparkling water to start?" Elizabeth blinked slowly, lips parting slightly. Her voice, when it came, was soft, formal, Japanese accented English, shaped by years of boardrooms and interpreters. "Spark-ling, please," she said, each syllable deliberate. The waiter nodded too quickly. "And would you like to order food now or wait for someone?" "I am alone." The words hung in the air a moment longer than necessary. She saw it, a flicker of discomfort in the boy's eyes, not pity, not judgment, something in between. He cleared his throat. "All right, I'll be right back." When he returned, she tried to ask a question about the menu. Her voice was quieter this time, and the words stumbled out unevenly. Something about dairy, something about preparation. The waiter frowned. "Sorry, you mean no cheese?" He glanced over his shoulder for help, but none came. Elizabeth nodded, hesitating. "Yes, no. Milk? Butter?" He didn't quite answer. "I think it should be fine. I'll check." He didn't check. Nearby, a table of 3 began whispering, one of them suppressing a smirk. Another couple glanced over, then away, then back again. Elizabeth noticed. Of course she noticed. Her fingers tightened around the stem of her glass. She pressed her lips together. The room hadn't changed, but it felt colder. She was no longer the imposing figure from 10 minutes ago. She was now the rich foreign lady who couldn't order dinner. A sense of isolation crept in, not the kind that came from eating alone, but the kind that bloomed when a person realized they were invisible in a room full of eyes. Elizabeth had dined with presidents, negotiated across continents, and stood at the helm of billion-dollar ventures. Yet here, in this room of laughter and white truffles, she could not even ask for a meal without losing something quietly essential. She looked down at the linen napkin in her lap, her reflection faint in the polished silver knife beside her plate. Her hands, so steady in boardrooms, trembled just slightly. Across the room, Charlotte noticed. She had been watching since Elizabeth walked in, not out of awe, but recognition. There was something in the woman's silence she understood too well. Charlotte moved among the tables with practiced rhythm, refilling water glasses and offering wine lists with a polite, measured smile. She wore a simple black uniform, her hair in a neat low bun, and a name tag that almost always went unnoticed. Charlotte Matsuda, 22, waitress by night, psychology student by morning, and granddaughter of a woman who had once crossed oceans with only her language and her pride to carry. She'd heard the stumbles, seen the waiter flinch, watched the customers react. She hated how familiar it all felt. Still, she hesitated. It wasn't her section. Elizabeth was under someone else's service. Crossing over could get her written up again. Last time, it had cost her an entire weekend shift. But Charlotte's grandmother had always said, if you see someone drowning in silence, throw them your voice. Charlotte stepped back into the kitchen, heart tugging. From there, she could still see Elizabeth's table through the service window. The woman sat straighter now, but there was something crumbling behind her eyes. Her hand hovered over the order screen, then dropped. She made her decision. Instead of taking her break, Charlotte slipped back into the dining area and started walking, slowly, carefully, toward the corner table. She didn't know yet what she would say, but she knew the words would matter, and she knew she would say them in Japanese. Charlotte's shoes clicked softly against the tile as she walked back toward the staff corridor, her thoughts louder than the ambient jazz floating through the restaurant. She paused at the industrial sink, taking a moment to breathe, the silver tray in her hands suddenly heavier than it should be. The corners of the room buzzed with quiet luxury, but her mind was elsewhere, still watching that elegant woman sitting alone in the corner, eyes full of grace, pride, and now something else, something sadder. Charlotte knew that look, not because she'd seen it in strangers, but because she'd seen it in her grandmother. She wiped her palms against her apron, staring at her own reflection in the brushed steel door of the freezer. 22. Sleepless eyes. Faint ink smudges on her wrist from a midterm she'd rushed through earlier that morning. And somewhere under it all, a constant, unrelenting pressure that came from living a life pieced together by effort, not luck. She worked 5 days a week at La Rue, 2 nights as a part-time tutor, and juggled a full course load at NYU. Even then, she was months behind on tuition and barely managing to cover medication for her grandmother, Aiko, who had raised her alone since she was 6. They shared a small apartment in Queens. It smelled faintly of green tea and old wood, and was filled with small reminders of Japan, ink paintings, worn tatami mats, and an altar with a photo of Charlotte's late mother. Aiko had never returned to Japan. "My home is where you are," she'd always say. It was Aiko who taught Charlotte to speak Japanese, not as a chore or duty, but as a gift. Even when bills piled up, even when the world outside ignored them, she insisted on morning greetings, chopsticks held properly, and the difference between tatami and honey, what you show the world and what you truly feel. Flashback. Charlotte was 10, sitting cross-legged on the rug, carefully copying characters with a brush dipped in black ink. Her grandmother sat across from her, nodding with quiet approval. "Kokoro," Aiko whispered, pointing. "It means heart, but not the one that beats here." She tapped her chest. "It's the heart that lives in your spirit. It's who you are when no one is watching." That lesson stayed with her, especially on nights like this. Back in the present, Charlotte leaned against the kitchen counter, arms crossed, wrestling with a growing sense of discomfort. Not from the long shift or the ache in her legs, but from watching someone else's dignity get slowly chipped away, bite by bite. Elizabeth Maury was supposed to be untouchable, powerful, and yet she had been left to stumble through a language not her own, in front of people too uncomfortable or unwilling to help. Still, Charlotte hesitated. Her section was on the other side of the restaurant. Her manager, Josh, had made it crystal clear, don't cross into another server's zone unless it's an emergency. And this wasn't technically an emergency. Not in any way that showed up on a performance review. And yet, Charlotte peeked through the edge of the swinging door and caught sight of the woman again. Elizabeth hadn't moved much. Her fingers were still wrapped gently around her glass, her eyes fixed on the middle distance. Alone, in every sense. Charlotte's fingers brushed the small pendant at her neck, a simple red string with a carved piece of jade her grandmother had given her. For protection, Aiko had said, but also to remind you who you are. She thought of the woman's effort to speak clearly, the tension in her shoulders, the way the waiter had looked at her, not cruelly, but carelessly. Charlotte had seen what that kind of disregard could do, how it built over time, leaving scars that didn't show. She could still hear her grandmother's voice. Never make someone feel small just because the world doesn't speak their language. When you speak to someone in their mother tongue, you speak to their soul. And this woman, whoever she was alone, drifting in a room full of people too well fed to notice her sinking. Charlotte made a decision. She set the tray down. "Hey," her co-worker Leo called softly from behind her. "You okay?" She nodded. "Yeah, just need a minute." Leo shrugged and went back to folding napkins. Charlotte didn't ask permission. She just stepped forward, wiping her hands one last time, then weaving her way back onto the restaurant floor. Her name tag flashed under the light. Her pulse quickened. Every step toward Elizabeth's table felt heavier, like walking against a current of invisible rules and watchful eyes. She could feel her manager's gaze from the host stand. She knew the other server, Ben, would probably complain. But none of that mattered now. When she reached the table, she stopped a respectful distance away, folded her hands in front of her, and spoke gently, in flawless, careful Japanese. "Sumimasen, okiaku-sama, moshiwake arimasen ga, nanika o mitsukashi shimasen deshita ka?" "Excuse me, ma'am. I'm sorry to bother you, but may I help you with anything?" Elizabeth turned slowly, her eyes widening just slightly. In that moment, something shifted. Not in the room, not in the lighting, but in the air between them. It was as if someone had cracked a window open in a stifling room. A breath of familiarity, a tether back to solid ground. Elizabeth stared at her, not in disbelief, but in something closer to recognition. Charlotte waited, calm and steady, and Elizabeth Morey smiled. Elizabeth stared at the young woman in front of her. For a moment, the world seemed to pause. She had grown used to silence, not the peaceful kind, but the kind that closed in around you, when you were misunderstood, misplaced, made smaller by every unsure glance and incomplete sentence. But this was something else. A young waitress had just addressed her in polished, respectful Japanese. Charlotte stood still, her expression open and composed. She didn't fidget, didn't shrink. She had delivered her words with care, her voice low enough not to draw attention, but confident enough to reach a woman who hadn't heard her own language in days. Elizabeth blinked once, then again, and then, softly, she nodded. "Arigatou gozaimasu," she murmured, her voice catching slightly. "Thank you," Charlotte offered a faint smile. "If you like, I can explain the menu to you in Japanese, or I can translate what you'd like to ask. I just want to help." Elizabeth looked at her with an expression that was difficult to read, equal parts surprise, curiosity, and quiet relief. Then she motioned to the seat beside her. Charlotte hesitated. She wasn't supposed to sit with customers, not under any circumstances, but something about the way Elizabeth gestured made it feel less like an order and more like permission, a rare invitation to bridge a quiet distance. She sat down at the very edge of the chair. Over the next few minutes, Charlotte gently walked Elizabeth through the menu, answering her questions in the same respectful tone she would use with her grandmother. The woman asked about ingredients, preparation methods, dairy content, each time more at ease. Charlotte took notes, then returned to the kitchen to place the order herself, explaining everything clearly to the chefs. She didn't say a word to Ben, the original server. His expression tightened when he saw her with Elizabeth's order, but he said nothing. When she returned to the table, Elizabeth had her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her shoulders, once tight with tension, had relaxed slightly. "You speak beautifully," she said in Japanese, her accent more pronounced now, warmer. "My grandmother raised me," Charlotte replied softly. "She never let me forget where we came from." Elizabeth nodded, a knowing smile flickering on her lips. "And where is that?" "Nagano," Charlotte said. "She left Japan a long time ago, but she brought everything important with her." Then she was a wise woman. Charlotte paused, studying the woman more closely. Elizabeth's earrings were emeralds. Her watch was vintage Cartier. Everything about her exuded control, except her eyes. They were glassy now, and a little red around the edges. Charlotte didn't comment. She simply offered a small cup of warm tea that she'd brought without asking. Elizabeth took it with a quiet thank you and cradled it between her hands like a small source of heat in a cold place. They didn't speak much after that, but they didn't need to. Charlotte hovered nearby for the rest of the meal, never intruding but always watching. She refilled water, adjusted the lighting at the table slightly, and even intercepted a junior waiter who nearly dropped a tray nearby. Other patrons began to notice. A few glanced over at the quiet table in the corner, puzzled. What had changed? Nothing dramatic had happened, and yet the atmosphere around Elizabeth's table had shifted. It no longer radiated discomfort, but calm, like a storm cloud had passed and sunlight was breaking through. Ben kept his distance. The manager shot Charlotte a questioning look from across the room, but didn't intervene. When dessert was offered, Elizabeth declined with a slight shake of her head. "I have had enough sweetness for one evening," she said with a faint smile. Charlotte offered a small bow. "I'm glad I could be of help." Elizabeth reached into her clutch and pulled out a pen. With careful strokes, she wrote something on the back of the restaurant's branded card. Then she folded several crisp bills into the check holder, more than generous, excessive even, but it wasn't just about the money. As she stood, she looked at Charlotte one last time. "You reminded me tonight that I am not invisible," she said. "That is a greater kindness than you may ever realize." Charlotte bowed again, touched but unsure what to say. Elizabeth left quietly, as elegantly as she had entered. After she disappeared through the glass doors, Charlotte retrieved the note from the table. Written in graceful Japanese calligraphy were only a few words. "A true heart recognizes another. We will meet again." Charlotte read it twice, her breath catching. She didn't know then just how true those words would become. But something inside her had already shifted. She looked down at the folded paper, then at the seat Elizabeth had left behind. It was empty, yes, but it no longer felt like loss. It felt like a beginning. 3 weeks passed. The memory of that night, of Elizabeth Morey's quiet grace, her near tears, her handwritten note, lingered like a delicate scent on Charlotte's clothes. But the world moved on. So did Charlotte. Finals approached. Rent was due. The restaurant grew busier with end-of-season dinners and post-market closings. Most nights blurred together. She still took the 6 train back to Queens, still balanced textbooks on the kitchen counter while stirring miso soup for her grandmother, and still wore the same plain black shoes that rubbed her heels raw by hour 6. Sometimes, when the restaurant was quiet and the lights dimmed just right, Charlotte would glance toward that same corner table, where Elizabeth had once sat, composed and alone, and wonder if it had really happened. No one mentioned her again. Not Ben, not her manager, Josh, not the guests. It felt like a beautiful story that had closed too early, until the envelope arrived. It was left on the manager's desk one afternoon, sealed in cream-colored linen paper, with Charlotte's name handwritten on the front in black ink. Just Charlotte, no last name. But the writing was precise, decisive even. Josh held it like it might contain a lawsuit. "You getting fan mail now?" he joked, raising a brow. Charlotte took the envelope slowly, her stomach tightening. The paper was heavy, elegant, the kind of paper that didn't belong anywhere near a restaurant like La Rue. She opened it carefully. Inside was a letter, not typed, written by hand in English this time, fluent and clear. "Charlotte, the kindness you showed me did not go unnoticed, nor will it be forgotten. I would be honored if you would attend the World Horizons Gala next Friday evening as my personal guest. It is a celebration of international collaboration, growth, and quiet strength, qualities you already possess in abundance. I will have an invitation waiting for you at the door. With respect, Elizabeth Morey." Tucked behind the letter was a formal invitation on thick embossed cardstock, gold lettering. The event would be held at the Larchmont, a private, members-only estate used for elite gatherings in the city. Names like former prime ministers, CEOs, cultural leaders, and tech moguls were casually listed among the expected guests. Charlotte read the note twice, then a third time. Her throat tightened. Josh peeked over the counter. "So, what is it?" "A gala," Charlotte said slowly. He snorted. "Like a party? Like a gala?" She held up the invitation. It shimmered under the overhead lights. Josh narrowed his eyes. "Wait, is this from that woman? The rich one? What's she want?" Charlotte didn't answer right away. A small part of her wasn't sure. That night at home, she showed the letter to her grandmother. Aiko Matsuda held it delicately, like it might melt. She didn't say anything at first. She simply read. Then she folded the letter again, set it aside, and looked directly into Charlotte's eyes. "She saw you," Aiko said gently. Charlotte blinked. "What do you mean?" "She saw you. Not just a waitress. Not just a girl with a name tag. She saw what I see every day." Charlotte exhaled slowly, uncertain. "It feels like too much. Like maybe I was just lucky, or polite at the right time. Kindness is never just." Aiko reached over, placing her wrinkled hand on Charlotte's. "Some people spend their whole lives surrounded by money and still starve for decency. You offered yours freely." Charlotte looked down at the invitation again. She had never owned a gown. She didn't know what fork to use at a formal dinner. The most expensive thing she owned was a laptop with a cracked screen. How could she possibly walk into a room full of billionaires? "I won't fit in," she whispered. Her grandmother smiled softly. "No, you'll stand out." "Do ye?" By the time Friday arrived, Charlotte had borrowed a dress from her roommate's older sister, a sleek navy blue gown with a high neckline and a soft shimmer. It wasn't designer, but it fit her frame like it belonged. She wore her grandmother's pendant, tucked her hair into a loose chignon, slipped on her cleanest shoes, and tried to ignore the panic building in her chest. She took a cab to the Larchmont. The building stood like a palace, wrapped in modern steel, tall, elegant, understated, in a way that screamed wealth. Staff in suits stood outside, checking names at the door. Charlotte stepped forward, nervous. "Hi, I think my name should be on the list." The woman behind the podium looked her over quickly, as if trying to place her. "Name? Charlotte Matsuda. I'm a guest of Ms. Elizabeth Morey." The woman's demeanor changed instantly. She typed something, nodded, then smiled. "Of course. Ms. Morey asked us to expect you. Right this way." The doors opened. Warm, golden light spilled from the hall beyond. Charlotte took one breath and walked inside. The ceiling glittered with crystal and gold. Charlotte stood at the edge of the ballroom, frozen beneath a chandelier the size of a city bus, suspended like a fallen star. The air was perfumed with something floral and faintly foreign. Strings from a live quartet floated above the sound of clinking glasses and effortless conversation. Everywhere she turned, there were people dressed in designer gowns and tailored suits, each one more polished than the last. Laughter was practiced, smiles were sharp. Conversations felt like duels dressed as dances. And Charlotte, wearing borrowed shoes and a second-hand dress, felt like she'd slipped through the wrong door. Until she saw her. Elizabeth Maury. The woman stood in the center of it all, surrounded by a small group of world leaders and business magnates, yet somehow still untouched by the noise. Her black gown shimmered like ink beneath the lights. Her hair was perfectly sculpted, but her eyes, those sharp, intelligent eyes, softened the moment they met Charlotte's. With one graceful gesture, Elizabeth excused herself and walked toward her. "Charlotte," she said, her voice like silk. Charlotte bowed instinctively. "Ms. Maury, thank you for—" Elizabeth shook her head. "No bowing tonight. Tonight you are my guest, not my servant, not my helper, my guest of honor." Charlotte stood still, unsure what to say. "Come," Elizabeth said. "There are people I'd like you to meet." Charlotte spent the next hour being gently pulled through circles of wealth and diplomacy. She was introduced to economists, artists, a Japanese ambassador, and a tech visionary who had just sold his third startup for $500 million. Some people greeted her warmly. Others offered polite but puzzled nods. One woman asked if Charlotte was a young diplomat from Japan. Another guessed she was Elizabeth's assistant. But Elizabeth corrected them each time with quiet, firm precision. "She is a student of strength and empathy, the kind of person the world doesn't see until they need her." As the evening wore on, a murmur passed through the room, one of those invisible signals that something was about to happen. Staff began gently guiding guests toward the front of the hall. A small stage had been set beneath the chandelier, framed by banners in Japanese and English. "World Horizons, Bridging Empathy and Enterprise." A spotlight came on. Elizabeth stepped up to the microphone. Charlotte stood frozen, her heart racing. Elizabeth scanned the room with the ease of someone used to commanding it, but her words, when she spoke, were soft and deliberate. "I've spent most of my life in boardrooms, airports, and languages that do not belong to me," she began. "I've worn titles, negotiated deals, been called many things, most of them flattering. But last month, in a restaurant just a few blocks from here, I was reminded that none of that truly matters." The room quieted. "I was reminded that dignity is not given by status or money or the size of your table," she said, her voice gaining strength. "It is preserved by the smallest, quietest acts, by those who see you when no one else does." She turned slightly, her eyes finding Charlotte in the crowd. There was a young woman that night, a stranger. She did not know who I was. She had no reason to help me, but she saw my discomfort and responded, not with pity, but with respect. She spoke to me in the language of my mother, the language of my home. A ripple went through the crowd. "She reminded me of something I had forgotten, that humanity is a kind of wealth, and empathy is a kind of power." She gestured toward Charlotte. "I would like to thank Charlotte Matsuda, not only for her kindness, but for her courage." Applause broke out across the room. Charlotte felt heat rise to her cheeks. She tried to smile, tried not to shrink under the weight of 100 eyes. But Elizabeth's gaze kept her steady. Later, as the crowd dispersed into smaller conversations again, Elizabeth found her near the refreshment table. "You did well," she said. "I didn't do anything," Charlotte replied. "You did everything." They sat together in a quiet lounge off the main floor, a low table between them, a plate of untouched hors d'oeuvres. "I've been wondering about you," Elizabeth said. "Who you are, what you want." Charlotte hesitated. "There's not much to say." "Try me." So Charlotte told her about the student loans, about working nights, about her grandmother and the apartment in Queens, about the dreams she had deferred more times than she could count. Elizabeth listened without interrupting, her hands folded, her eyes steady. When Charlotte finished, there was a long silence, and then a voice interrupted. "Ms. Morey." A tall man in a grey suit approached, late 40s, sleek watch, polished voice. "Forgive me. I couldn't help overhearing." He turned to Charlotte. "I'm Alan Bryce. I run talent acquisitions for Valentech. We're always looking for fresh minds. I'd love to talk with you sometime." Charlotte glanced at Elizabeth, unsure. Alan kept going. "You're clearly smart and charming. I imagine with a little polish, you'd fit right into our junior leadership track. You'd be amazed how quickly you can rise when the right people notice." There it was, the assumption, the offer wrapped in condescension, the idea that Charlotte was a lucky nobody, hungry for a shortcut. Before Charlotte could reply, Elizabeth stood. "She is not here for recruitment," she said sharply. "She's here because she already belongs." Alan blinked. "I didn't mean to offend." Elizabeth didn't back down. "Then perhaps try listening next time, instead of selling." She turned to Charlotte. "People like him," she said, loud enough for others nearby to hear. "We'll always try to offer you things you've already earned. Don't let them convince you otherwise." Charlotte's chest tightened. It was the first time in years someone had defended her so openly, so fiercely. Alan bowed slightly and walked away, discomfort flickering across his polished face. Elizabeth turned back to Charlotte, her tone soft again. "You don't need a spotlight to prove your worth," she said. "You just need someone to protect your light until you're ready to shine." Charlotte looked down at her lap, speechless. But her heart was already answering. The night after the gala, Charlotte lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Sleep wouldn't come. The chandelier still glimmered in her memory. The applause, the music, the feeling of standing on unfamiliar ground and somehow not sinking. It all played back in her mind like a dream she wasn't sure she belonged to, but it was Elizabeth's voice that echoed the loudest. She's here because she already belongs. 2 days later, a package arrived at the restaurant. It was hand-delivered in a matte black envelope, addressed simply, Charlotte Matsuda. Inside was a folded letter. Elegant paper, delicate strokes, written in Elizabeth's handwriting. "Charlotte, our conversation left me thinking not only about your story, but the potential paths ahead of you. I'd like to clear one of those paths. I've arranged for a full scholarship to the university of your choice. Tuition, books, housing, covered. No contracts, no obligations. The only condition is this, that you use it to become the person the world doesn't yet know it needs. The scholarship has already been approved through a private foundation. All you need to do is say yes." Respectfully, Elizabeth Morey Charlotte stared at the letter for what felt like an hour. Full ride, no strings, any school. Her first instinct was disbelief. Her second was panic. That night, she sat across from her grandmother, the letter trembling in her hands. The kitchen smelled of rice and miso broth. Outside, the world carried on. Cars, sirens, the hum of the city. But inside, everything had stopped. "I can't take it," Charlotte said quietly. "It doesn't feel right." Aiko looked up from her bowl. "Why not?" "Because I didn't do anything. Not really, I was just polite. I spoke a language. That's not worth this." Aiko wiped her hands gently on a cloth napkin and leaned back in her chair. "No," she said. "You weren't just polite. You were brave." Charlotte's mouth tightened. It was one moment, one conversation. Sometimes one moment is enough. Aiko's voice was calm but firm. You didn't just speak her language. You saw her pain when everyone else chose to look away. That's not common, Charlotte. That's not luck. That's who you are. Charlotte didn't answer. Her mind flashed through the last 4 years, late-night study sessions under a flickering kitchen light, tutoring high school kids for grocery money, eating cereal for dinner 3 nights in a row, smiling through exhaustion just to keep a shift. She remembered the rejection letters, the jobs she took instead, the way she'd slowly convinced herself that dreaming too big only made the fall harder. And now, this. A door thrown wide open, beautiful, terrifying, and completely unearned. "Grandma," she said, voice cracking, "what if I'm not good enough?" Aiko reached across the table and took her hand. "Listen to me." Her tone softened. "You earned this the moment you chose kindness when no one else did." Charlotte looked down. "Some people wait their whole lives for a chance like this," Aiko continued. "But you didn't wait. You acted. That's the kind of person who deserves every door open to them." Tears welled in Charlotte's eyes. She wasn't crying out of joy. She was crying because, for the first time in years, she felt seen by someone other than her grandmother. She folded the letter again, this time not with fear, but with care. 3 days later, she met Elizabeth at a quiet garden cafe near Central Park. Elizabeth wore a simple grey coat, her hair pulled back, her demeanour calm as always. But there was a lightness to her Charlotte hadn't seen before. They didn't order food, just tea. "I didn't want to push you," Elizabeth said gently, "but I meant what I wrote." "I know," Charlotte said. Her voice was steadier now, "and I'm ready to say yes." Elizabeth smiled, not a triumphant smile, but something softer, a recognition. "I'm proud of you," she said. "I'm still scared." "Good." Elizabeth leaned in slightly. "It means it matters." Charlotte held her cup carefully. "Why me?" Elizabeth looked out toward the trees. "Because I've spent my life around people who mistake noise for strength, who walk through the world expecting doors to open for them and never thank those who hold them. But that night, you held a door open for someone who had long forgotten what it felt like." She paused. "And you did it without knowing who I was. That kind of heart is rare." Charlotte swallowed hard. "What do I do now?" she asked quietly. Elizabeth smiled. "You walk through." 3 years later, the lecture hall was filled with the low hum of laptops, rustling notebooks, and the soft shuffle of curiosity. The students sat scattered, some eager, some distracted, others trying to pretend they hadn't just rushed in from across campus. But when the professor entered, the room shifted. Charlotte Matsuda stepped to the front of the classroom with quiet confidence. Her dark blazer hung neatly over a pale blouse, and a slim silver chain held a familiar jade pendant around her neck. Her heels tapped once against the wood floor before she stopped and smiled at the class. "Welcome to cross-cultural psychology," she said, voice calm but commanding. "If you're here for a credit, that's fine. But I hope by the end, you're here for something more." There was a flicker of interest from the back row. Charlotte clicked the remote. A slide appeared on the screen, empathy as a bridge, when language isn't enough. She paused, and then, without her usual scripted intro, she began. "Years ago, I was working as a waitress in a high-end Manhattan restaurant. I was broke, exhausted, and unsure if I'd ever get out from under the weight of everything I was trying to carry." Some students looked up, eyebrows raised. "One night, a woman walked in, alone, powerful, impeccably dressed. The kind of person everyone notices, but no one dares to approach." Charlotte took a breath. She didn't speak English well, and when she tried to communicate with the staff, things got awkward. People grew impatient. A few laughed quietly. She paused again, letting the silence stretch. I watched from across the room, knowing exactly what she was feeling, and how badly she was trying to hide it. A few pens stopped moving. So I stepped in. I spoke to her in Japanese, my grandmother's language, a language that hadn't felt useful in years. She smiled softly, and just like that, everything changed, not just for her, for me. She walked slowly toward the edge of the stage. That moment didn't lead to applause. There was no dramatic music, just a conversation, a connection, a pause in someone's loneliness. But that moment, she gestured to herself, her clothes, the classroom, led to this. After the lecture, a few students lingered to ask questions. One of them, a quiet girl in a thrifted sweater, approached shyly. "Professor Matsuda, do you really think one small act can change a life?" Charlotte smiled. "I don't think it," she said. "I know it." Charlotte's new life hadn't happened overnight. It was built moment by moment, class by class, page by page. With Elizabeth's scholarship, she transferred to Columbia. She double-majored in psychology and East Asian studies. For the first time, she didn't have to split her focus between school and survival. She still worked part-time, out of habit more than necessity, but her hours went to tutoring and research, not folding napkins or scrubbing trays. Her world expanded, and so did her confidence. Elizabeth didn't just offer financial support, she became a mentor, a guide, a protector. They met monthly for tea, often at the same garden cafe where they'd once spoken about fear and potential. Elizabeth would listen more than she spoke, offering precise advice only when Charlotte asked for it. She never flaunted her generosity. Instead, she challenged Charlotte to match it. "Success," Elizabeth once told her, "is not the absence of need. It's the presence of purpose." A year into school, Charlotte started volunteering with first-generation college students, helping them navigate applications, loans, and language barriers. By graduation, she had created a program connecting multilingual students with incoming freshmen from immigrant households. By her second year of graduate school, she had written a paper on cross-linguistic empathy that was published in a respected academic journal. Elizabeth had it framed. When Charlotte defended her thesis, her grandmother sat in the front row, wearing the same patterned scarf she'd worn to every milestone in Charlotte's life. That night, Charlotte held the diploma with both hands, tears in her eyes. "We did it," she whispered. One spring evening, Charlotte returned to LaRue. Not to work, not to serve, just to sit. She reserved the same table where Elizabeth had once sat alone. When the waiter approached, she smiled. "Sparkling water, please." Then she took out her laptop and began to write a lesson plan. She didn't tell the waiter that this place had once been her battlefield. She didn't need to. That chapter had ended. As she walked out, she noticed a young server nearby, a girl no older than she had been on that night, nervously balancing a tray, eyes darting. Charlotte paused. "First week?" she asked gently. The girl nodded. "Is it that obvious?" Charlotte smiled. "You're doing fine." Then she placed a folded $20 bill into the girl's hand and whispered, "Just remember, it's not always about the food. Sometimes people just need to be seen." Back in the present, Charlotte stepped off the lecture stage, still feeling the afterglow of the story she had just shared. It wasn't about impressing her students. It was about reminding them, reminding herself, that kindness was a currency with far greater value than applause or degrees. As she packed her notes, a student caught up with her at the door. "Hey, Professor," Charlotte turned. "Would you have done it, spoken to her, if you'd known who she was?" Charlotte smiled. "No," she said softly, "I did it because I didn't." She walked down the hallway as students trickled out behind her, her heels echoing down polished floors. Outside, the late afternoon sun painted everything in golden light. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she no longer feared the future. She had already stepped through the hardest door. And on the other side, a life worth living, a story worth telling. Sometimes the smallest moments change the biggest lives. If this story moved you, leave a like and subscribe for more.